If you enjoyed this story of ingenuity and survival, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with more incredible frontier stories. Share this video with a friend who loves discovering lost wisdom from the past. And stay tuned for the next chapter in this remarkable journey. The wilderness never believed he could survive it. The mountains never believed he could outsmart them. But what this man uncovered in the harshest of winters will change everything you thought you knew about survival. Stay with us to find out how one simple invention defied all odds and kept him alive when the world outside was frozen in time. In a small, isolated town, nestled in the heart of a valley, surrounded by towering peaks, winter had always been the harshest of adversaries. The cold in this part of the world was like an unyielding force of nature, biting and relentless, capable of chilling a man to the bone, no matter how many layers he wore. It was survival, plain and simple. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to the ways of the land, relying on age-old methods passed down from one generation to the next. But there was one man who didn't accept the cold as a fact of life. He saw it as a challenge. His name was Thomas Granger, a quiet and contemplative figure who had lived in the wilderness for as long as he could remember. With his rugged appearance, a face weathered by countless seasons of harsh winds and bitter cold, he didn't look like a man who sought comfort. He was a man of action, of thought, a problem solver by nature. He knew the world around him was unforgiving, but he also knew that there were secrets, untapped and hidden, that could be used to turn the tide in his favor. As the winter of 1837 set in, the cold began to grip tighter. Neighbors and fellow settlers struggled to keep their homes warm, their fires barely holding against the bitter chill. Many thought that surviving through such a season was simply a matter of enduring the elements until the thaw came. But not Thomas. He refused to simply endure. He believed there had to be a better way. One evening, as the snow fell heavily outside, Thomas stood at his cabin's door, gazing at the dense blanket of white that surrounded him. It was then that the idea came to him. The town relied on traditional log cabins for shelter, but Thomas saw something different, a structure that could trap the warmth of the sun and provide insulation from the cold. The concept was radical, almost laughable in a place where tradition was everything. He envisioned a Quonset hut not built of wood but of metal, with a greenhouse layer protecting it from the elements. The Quonset hut was not new, but to use it in such a remote and harsh environment with the added greenhouse for insulation was unheard of. His neighbors would laugh, of course. They would call him foolish. But Thomas was determined. He knew that survival required more than simply holding on. It required adapting, innovating, and challenging the very elements that sought to defeat him. The winter winds howled as Thomas worked through the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air. It was an arduous task, but one that he undertook with purpose. Day after day he labored, shaping the metal structure, bending the steel arches into place, and covering the framework with insulating materials. The greenhouse, a simple yet effective design, was built atop the hut, allowing sunlight to filter through the clear panels, capturing the warmth of the sun during the day and holding it in during the night. His neighbors, however, didn't see the brilliance of his plan. They saw only a man wasting his time on something that seemed too far-fetched. "You'll freeze before that thing ever works," one of them mocked as Thomas hammered in another nail. The laughter echoed in the distance, but Thomas didn't let it deter him. He knew that every great idea had its doubters. If it was easy, everyone would do it. The structure slowly took shape, standing in stark contrast to the traditional log cabins that dotted the town. Its curved metal frame seemed out of place against the snow-covered landscape. Some of the townsfolk began to gather near his cabin, peering over at the strange construction. Whispers of ridicule spread like wildfire. "He's gone mad," one said. "This won't last a week," another whispered. But Thomas didn't care. He wasn't building for approval or praise. He was building for survival. He knew that in a few short months, the deep freeze of winter would descend upon them in full force. The temperature could dip to unimaginable lows, and those who didn't prepare properly would suffer. As the first snowflakes of the season began to settle, Thomas stepped back and surveyed the completed structure. The Quonset hut, with its protective greenhouse roof, stood resilient and solid against the elements. The critics were right about one thing: it was unlike anything the town had ever seen. But what they didn't understand was that was exactly what they needed. That evening, as the temperature dropped well below zero, Thomas entered the hut and closed the door behind him. The warmth inside was immediately noticeable, a stark contrast to the cold, biting air outside. He checked the thermometer, and his heart leaped. The inside temperature was a full 47 degrees warmer than outside. The mockery had started, but soon it would stop. What Thomas had built wasn't just a shelter. It was the future, a future that would rewrite the rules of survival in the wilderness. The first night Thomas spent in the Quonset hut was a test like no other. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees and sending snow swirling through the air, but inside he was untouched by the elements. The warmth was palpable, a steady comfort that wrapped around him like a thick blanket. He had spent months working tirelessly, but it was in these early hours of the night, as the wind screamed its fury against the walls, that he would truly know if his idea had worked. He sat by the stove, his thick leather gloves now resting on the warm metal of the pot-belly stove. The crackling fire flickered in front of him, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The air was different in this hut. It wasn't the dry chill of the cold mountains that usually pierced to the bone. It was warm, steady, and comforting. He could already feel the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. Outside, the temperature was dropping fast. The cold was settling in for the night, and Thomas knew the harsh reality of what awaited those who hadn't prepared. The kind of cold that could freeze a man solid if he wasn't careful. He had seen it before in the early winters when lives were lost to the relentless chill. But not tonight. As the fire crackled, Thomas lay back on his bed of furs, gazing at the ceiling. He had done it. His creation, his invention, was keeping him warm. Not just warm enough to survive, but warm enough to be comfortable, a luxury that most people living in the frontier never experienced. His mind wandered to his neighbors. He wondered if any of them were sitting in their cabins, shivering under blankets, while he was tucked inside his own fortress of warmth. The wind outside picked up, and the first heavy snowfall began to blanket the ground. It was beautiful in a way, the world outside turning into a pristine sheet of white. But Thomas didn't think about the beauty of the snow for long. His thoughts returned to the work ahead. This winter was only the beginning. If he could make it through this harsh season, he could prove to everyone that his method could work. He would show them that there was more to survival than just getting by. There was a way to thrive. As the night wore on, he drifted into a deep sleep. The warmth of the Quonset hut kept him comfortable, and he dreamed of the future, a future where no one would have to fear the coming winter, a future where the mountains wouldn't be so unforgiving. But the next morning would bring a new test, the neighbors' reaction. He couldn't help but wonder, how long before they came to see his foolish invention for themselves? By morning, the snow had piled up outside the Quonset hut, and the world beyond was buried under a blanket of white. Thomas woke to the warmth that surrounded him, his breath visible in the cool air, but not nearly as cold as the wind, howling just beyond the walls. He had made it through the first night with ease, but now, as dawn broke over the mountains, he knew that his work had only just begun. The first sign that his neighbors were starting to take notice came as he stepped outside. A few people were standing at the edge of his property, watching from a distance. The skepticism that had filled their eyes when they first saw him building his strange structure was now replaced with curiosity. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. No one had seen anything like it before. A greenhouse over a Quonset hut? It was unheard of. But Thomas knew better than to be satisfied with just the idea. He needed results. He went inside, closed the door behind him, and stood by the stove. His fingers still tingled from the cold outside, but the warmth inside was unwavering. The thermometer was reading steady, indicating that the temperature had remained far warmer than the outdoors. If anyone came inside now, they would feel it for themselves. But that would be the next step. He couldn't force anyone to believe. They would have to see it for themselves. The day passed slowly, with Thomas working on small repairs and preparations. He had already started gathering more wood and materials for future improvements. He wanted the Quonset hut to be a complete shelter, not just a place to stay warm. He envisioned adding a larger cooking area, perhaps even more insulation. Every change was a step forward, another building block in his plan to make his creation the ultimate survival shelter. By mid-afternoon, a knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to find two of his neighbors standing on the other side. They were bundled up in their winter coats, their faces flushed from the cold. They didn't speak at first, just stood there for a moment, their eyes scanning the structure behind him. Finally, one of them spoke. "I don't know what to make of it, Thomas," the man said, his voice low. "But the fire's still going strong, and the snow's not even touching the windows." Thomas smiled but said nothing. This was his chance. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. His neighbors had come to see if his invention was truly what he claimed it was, and now they had seen the truth for themselves. "Come inside," Thomas offered. "See for yourselves." They hesitated, but followed him into the warmth. As they stepped through the door, their eyes widened in disbelief. The inside of the Quonset hut was warm and comfortable, not a trace of cold lingering in the air. One of the men touched the stove, then looked at Thomas in amazement. "You've done it," the other man said, shaking his head. "You've really done it." The words of praise were slow to come, but Thomas knew this was just the beginning. Word would spread, and soon others would come to see the warmth he had created. But for now, he was content. He had proven that his idea could work, and this was only the start of something much bigger. As days turned into weeks, the town began to buzz with quiet whispers and curious glances at Thomas's creation. At first, the cold was enough to keep most of the settlers huddled inside their own homes, leaving the outdoors abandoned and desolate. But with the advent of the new shelter, more and more people wandered by Thomas's Quonset hut, watching from a distance, drawn by the warmth that seemed to emanate from the metal structure. Still, for all the intrigue, there was a lingering resistance, a skepticism that refused to let go. Not everyone was ready to embrace Thomas's unconventional method of survival. The town's elders, those who had lived through the worst of the winters and upheld the old ways, were the most vocal in their opposition. They'd lived by their traditions, their methods passed down through generations, and to them, this new approach felt like an affront to everything they had known. "They say it's warmer inside," Old Man Peterson had muttered one evening, shaking his head as he looked toward the Quonset hut. "But there's no way that contraption will last through the next storm." Despite the fact that many had witnessed the hut's success firsthand, their pride kept them from accepting that a stranger's invention could challenge their way of life. Old habits were hard to break, and even harder to question. In the evenings, when the temperature dropped to well below freezing, Thomas would stand outside, leaning against the snow-covered rail, watching the snowflakes swirl in the wind. He couldn't help but overhear the murmurs from his neighbors as they passed by his hut. "He's wasting his time," they would say. "We've survived here for years without any of that nonsense. He'll learn the hard way." But as much as the resistance stung, Thomas refused to back down. He wasn't just building for today, he was building for the future, for a time when the old ways wouldn't suffice. He knew that the world was changing, and in the wilderness, change was survival. One evening, when the winds howled louder than usual and the snow piled higher than anyone had ever seen, Thomas sat inside, watching the thermometer climb steadily, comfortable, as the temperature outside dipped further into the negative. He knew the storm was fierce. But inside the hut, he was undeterred. He had faced this kind of cold before. The world outside was in turmoil, but his home was a fortress of warmth. Then, just as he had predicted, the storm raged overnight, and the wind sent ice-cold gusts howling through the town. But when the sun finally peeked over the ridge the following morning, Thomas stepped outside to find something he hadn't expected. The town was covered in a thick layer of snow, but the usual trail of footprints leading to other cabins was missing. The world around him looked like an untouched wilderness. The only set of footprints was his own. The storm had kept everyone inside, except Thomas. His Quonset hut had once again proven its worth. Winter wasn't kind to anyone, but as the season wore on, Thomas's Quonset hut began to prove its worth over and over again. The snow piled higher, the winds howled louder, and the freezing temperatures made even the most seasoned frontier settlers reconsider their methods. But as Thomas had envisioned, his invention became more than just a structure for shelter. It became a symbol. One by one, the neighbors began to take notice. It started with small talk, casual exchanges as people gathered near the hut, leaning in to feel the warmth that radiated from within. At first it was simply curiosity. After all, a warmer cabin was a luxury in the heart of a harsh winter. But it didn't take long for others to realize the true value of what Thomas had done. Word spread quickly. More families began stopping by to see the miraculous shelter firsthand, and while some still resisted, others were willing to admit that maybe Thomas had something after all. The truth was undeniable. As the cold worsened, the people of the town couldn't ignore that Thomas's Quonset was still standing, its greenhouse covering keeping the interior warm, even when the world outside seemed frozen in time. One day, as Thomas was working outside his cabin, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Annabelle, the widow, who lived at the edge of town. She had never been one for small talk or idle gossip, but Thomas had always admired her strength and resolve. Annabelle had weathered countless winters alone, her husband having died years ago, leaving her to fend for herself in the unforgiving mountains. She stood at the edge of the path, her silhouette dark against the snow. As he waved her over, she slowly approached, her steps careful but determined. "I've heard a lot of talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and I've seen the changes myself. People are finally starting to pay attention." Thomas smiled and stepped aside, gesturing for her to come inside. "Come and see for yourself," he invited. Annabelle hesitated, but only for a moment. She had been to his cabin once before, years ago, when she had offered to lend a hand during a particularly bad winter. At the time, she had been skeptical of Thomas's unconventional ways. But now, as she entered the Quonset hut, she was taken aback by the warmth and comfort that filled the space. Her eyes widened as she felt the difference in temperature. She had spent enough winters in the mountains to know what cold truly felt like, and this was something she had never experienced before. The warmth inside the hut wasn't just a matter of temperature. It was a sense of security, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I never thought I'd see the day," Annabelle murmured. "You've done it, Thomas. You've shown us a new way." And with that, Thomas knew the tide had turned. The resistance had started to fade, replaced by the quiet acceptance of those who had once doubted him. The town was beginning to see the truth, and the truth was this: Thomas's creation wasn't just a way to survive the winter. It was a new way of life, a life built on ingenuity, resilience, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. By the time the spring thaw began to break through the icy grip of winter, the Quonset hut had become a symbol of resilience. What had started as a solitary project had now grown into a movement, an idea that had spread far beyond the borders of Thomas's small valley. The neighbors who once mocked his vision were now looking to him for guidance, and more than one had come knocking at his door, eager to learn about his design. It was early in March when Samuel Bridger, one of the most respected men in the town, came to visit. Samuel had always been a man of tradition, someone who held on to the old ways of life with a firm hand, but Thomas had noticed a shift in him recently. His once cold eyes now sparkled with curiosity. "Thomas," Samuel called, as he approached the Quonset hut, his voice carrying across the snow. "I've been thinking about your idea. I'd like to see it for myself." The man had come alone, leaving his cabin behind for the first time in weeks. The last few months had been brutal for everyone, but Samuel had been one of the hardest hit. The temperature inside his own cabin had plummeted to near lethal levels during the worst of the cold spell, and he had finally been forced to admit that there might be a better way. Thomas welcomed him inside, his face calm, but eager to share his success. As Samuel entered, he immediately felt the warmth that filled the room, a stark contrast to the biting wind that still swept through the valley outside. The air inside was warm, almost too warm compared to the cold gusts outside. And for the first time, Samuel allowed himself to acknowledge that there was something truly remarkable about this structure. "Your Quonset hut," Samuel said, his voice slow and thoughtful. It's like nothing I've ever seen." Thomas chuckled softly, then replied, "It's the future, Samuel. The way we'll survive the winters ahead." The two men spent hours discussing the hut's design, how the greenhouse roof acted as a trap for the sun's heat, and how the thick insulation kept the warmth from escaping. Samuel listened intently, but it was clear that his mind was racing with ideas. He asked about the materials, the construction, and most importantly, whether it could be replicated for his own cabin. "You could build one just like mine," Thomas said, as he showed Samuel the blueprint he had sketched out. "But you'd have to be willing to do things a little differently. You'd have to trust the process." Samuel nodded, a hint of respect creeping into his usually stoic expression. The old ways were hard to shed, but the practicality of what Thomas had accomplished couldn't be ignored. The truth was that the Quonset hut was more than just a clever invention. It was a new way of thinking, one that might change the very fabric of frontier life. By the time Samuel left, he wasn't just a convert to Thomas's idea. He was an advocate, determined to make sure the people of Coldridge knew about the success Thomas had achieved. As he trudged back toward his cabin, he thought about his own struggles with the cold. The Quonset hut had opened his eyes, and now he wanted to see how far the idea could stretch. It wasn't just Samuel who was intrigued. Others, from distant settlements and towns nearby, had heard about the Quonset hut and its revolutionary design. It was the beginning of something far larger than Thomas had ever imagined. What had started as one man's determination to survive had ignited a spark of change that was spreading through the wilderness like wildfire. And as the last traces of winter faded into the distance, the town of Coldridge stood on the brink of something new. Thomas's invention had proven itself, but its real power lay in the way it had inspired others to think differently, to embrace change in the face of overwhelming odds. The warm winds of spring slowly crept into the valley, melting the last of the snow that had clung to the earth since the previous winter. With the change in seasons came a change in the town itself. People who had once doubted Thomas were now eager to adopt his methods. Word had spread beyond Coldridge, reaching the ears of neighboring settlements, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the Quonset hut and how they could replicate it for themselves. Thomas had never envisioned himself as a teacher, but now he found himself in that role. Families arrived at his cabin, their faces drawn with curiosity, and in some cases, desperation. They had survived the brutal winter, but they had seen firsthand how close they had come to losing everything. Many were eager to build their own Quonset huts, desperate to learn the secrets Thomas had discovered. Each day a new group would arrive, and Thomas would patiently explain his design, showing them the finer details of the hut's construction and the ingenious way it trapped heat. He spoke about the importance of the greenhouse roof and how the metal structure could withstand the weight of heavy snow. He demonstrated the insulating materials that he had used, showing how they were layered to keep the warmth in and the cold out. For Thomas, it was a humbling experience. He had never sought recognition or fame for his work. He simply wanted to survive and to help others do the same. But now, as he watched his neighbors, many of whom had once mocked him, eagerly taking notes and asking questions, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. His invention had not only survived, it had thrived. It was changing the way people thought about survival. As the days grew longer and the last remnants of winter faded into memory, Thomas found himself reflecting on what he had accomplished. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments of doubt, but he had stayed true to his vision, and now the valley was a different place. Coldridge had embraced change, and in doing so, it had embraced the future. The legacy of the Quonset hut was just beginning. What started as one man's solution to a single winter storm had now become a symbol of innovation and hope. It wasn't just about surviving the wilderness anymore. It was about thriving in it. In the years to come, Thomas's name would be spoken of with respect and admiration. The townsfolk would tell their children about the man who had built something greater than a cabin. He had built a new way of life. And as they faced the challenges of future winters, they would remember that survival wasn't just about holding on. It was about adapting, evolving, and finding new ways to live, just as Thomas had done all those years ago in the harsh mountains of the Rockies. As the heat of summer finally arrived in Coldridge, Thomas couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. The winter had been brutal, but now, with the long days and scorching sun, he faced a different kind of challenge. The Quonset hut had proven itself against the cold, but how would it hold up against the relentless heat of summer? Would the greenhouse roof, designed to trap warmth during the winter, become a furnace in the heat of July? The first few days of summer brought with them a wave of unexpected warmth. The sun beat down on the mountains, and the air in the valley grew thick and heavy with humidity. Thomas knew that a heat wave was coming, and as he stood outside his hut, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, he wondered if he had overestimated the shelter's ability to withstand such intense heat. As the temperature inside the Quonset hut began to rise, Thomas grew concerned. He had built the greenhouse roof to let sunlight in during the winter months, but now it seemed to amplify the heat. He had spent years battling the cold, but he knew very little about how to manage the extreme heat. Would the hut become unbearable in the months to come? The first real test came one afternoon when the thermometer inside the hut spiked to nearly 90 degrees. It was hot, but still bearable, and the air inside was dry and still. The fire that had kept him warm all winter now felt out of place, and the stove was turned off, leaving the hut to absorb the warmth of the sun. But as the hours passed, Thomas realized that he was going to need a solution, and fast. He began to experiment. Using materials he had on hand, Thomas worked to create a simple ventilation system. He placed shutters along the sides of the hut, opening up gaps in the structure to allow air to flow through. As the breeze outside shifted, the cool air began to flow into the Quonset hut, cooling the space ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the summer wore on, Thomas made small adjustments, testing new ways to keep the heat at bay. He planted vines and thick foliage around the perimeter of the hut, hoping the plants would help to cool the air. Slowly, the hut began to adapt, just as it had to the cold. The greenhouse roof still worked, but now, instead of trapping heat, it served as a shield, providing shade and shelter from the sun's harsh rays. By the time the summer reached its peak, Thomas had perfected a system of natural ventilation that kept the Quonset hut comfortable even in the hottest part of the year. It was a constant battle, but as always, Thomas was willing to fight. The Quonset hut had survived the most bitter of winters, and now it was proving its worth in the summer heat. He sat outside one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and orange. The valley was still, and the warm breeze carried the scent of fresh pine. The Quonset hut, now more than just a shelter, stood as a testament to his ability to adapt and innovate. It was a symbol not only of survival, but of perseverance. It was a reminder that no matter the season, no matter the challenge, one man's vision could change the course of history. As time passed, the Quonset hut continued to prove itself in every season, becoming more than just a shelter for Thomas. It had become a part of Coldridge's history, a symbol of survival and ingenuity. People from surrounding towns came to visit, drawn by the success of Thomas's invention and eager to see it for themselves. Many of them took the designs home, adapting them to fit their own needs, while others sought Thomas's expertise in building their own Quonset huts. By the time the next winter arrived, the town of Coldridge was changed. The idea of the Quonset hut had spread like wildfire, and the people who had once scoffed at Thomas's plan were now eager to embrace it. Even the most stubborn settlers, those who had never trusted anything other than the traditional log cabin, had begun to see the value in the design. But for Thomas, the success of his invention was bittersweet. He had never sought recognition for his work. His only goal had been survival, to find a way to endure the winters and the harsh conditions that came with living in the mountains. But now his Quonset hut was no longer just a solution to a personal problem. It was a legacy. One evening, as he sat by the fire in his now well-established Quonset hut, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Samuel Bridger standing on the porch, a smile on his face. "You've done it, Thomas," Samuel said, shaking his hand. "Your design has changed everything. Coldridge is thriving, and it's all because of you." Thomas nodded quietly, feeling the weight of Samuel's words. He had never wanted fame or recognition, but he couldn't deny the sense of accomplishment that settled over him. His work had not only kept him alive, but had saved countless others from the worst of the winter. As the years passed, the Quonset hut continued to stand strong against the cold and the heat. It became a staple of survival for the frontier settlers, and its influence spread to neighboring areas. Thomas's invention had done more than just provide shelter. It had reshaped the way people thought about survival in the wilderness. In the end, it wasn't just the Quonset hut that left a lasting legacy. It was the spirit of resilience, innovation, and adaptability that Thomas had instilled in his community. His story was no longer just about surviving the mountain winters. It was about thriving in them, and for generations to come, that spirit would endure. As Thomas sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, he knew that his work would continue long after he was gone. The Quonset hut had become more than just a structure. It had become a symbol of what could be achieved when a person refused to accept the cold, the harshness, and the limits of nature. It was a testament to the power of invention and a legacy that would live on for generations. Years passed, and Coldridge began to transform in ways that no one could have predicted. The once struggling town, isolated by the towering peaks of the Rockies, now stood as a thriving testament to what innovation and resilience could achieve. Thomas's Quonset hut had become more than just a shelter. It had become a way of life. The young and the old alike spoke of it with reverence, and its design had begun to spread beyond the valley, sparking new ideas and projects all over the frontier. But despite all the changes around him, Thomas remained a humble figure. He had always believed that the greatest accomplishments were the ones that benefited everyone, not just the individual. And now, as he stood in front of a new generation of pioneers, eager to learn from his experience, he knew his work was far from over. One crisp fall day, Thomas was called to the town square by a young man named Elijah, who had recently settled in Coldridge. Elijah was full of ambition, eager to carry the torch forward. He had heard stories of Thomas's Quonset hut and was determined to build one for his own family. But there was a catch. Elijah wasn't just interested in replicating the design. He wanted to improve it, to make it even more efficient, even more sustainable. "Mr. Granger," Elijah said, standing with his hands on his hips, "I've heard you've built the perfect shelter for the harshest of winters. But what if we could build a home that could last year-round? One that doesn't just protect us from the cold, but also from the summer heat? What if we could make it self-sustaining, with a garden that grows in the winter and collects rainwater for use in the summer?" Thomas smiled at the enthusiasm in Elijah's voice. He saw the same spark in the young man's eyes that he had once had when he first started his own journey. He had always known that his Quonset hut wasn't the end of the story, but rather the beginning. It was a foundation, a starting point for something greater. "You've got the right ideas, Elijah," Thomas said, patting him on the back. "The next generation is always going to take things further than we did. It's a good thing, a necessary thing. But remember, innovation doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes failures. You have to be willing to adapt, just like I did when I first started." For the next few months, Thomas and Elijah worked together, combining their knowledge and skills. Elijah brought new ideas to the table: systems to collect rainwater, advanced insulation techniques, and methods for growing food year-round using a mix of greenhouses and clever irrigation. Thomas, for his part, provided the wisdom he had gained over the years. They spent countless hours experimenting, building, and tweaking, pushing the boundaries of what the Quonset hut could become. Word of their work spread, and soon other young settlers came to Coldridge to learn from Thomas and Elijah. What started as a single man's quest for survival had blossomed into a community-wide effort to improve life on the frontier. Thomas had always been a man of action, but now he saw the full impact of his work, not just in the survival of his family, but in the thriving of an entire town, one that had learned to adapt, innovate, and create. As the first frost of the season settled over Coldridge, Thomas felt a sense of peace. He had given the town more than just a way to survive the winters. He had given them hope. And now, with the new generation picking up where he had left off, he knew the legacy of the Quonset hut would live on for years to come. The years had been kind to Thomas, and as the seasons passed, he found himself spending more time reflecting on his journey. Coldridge had changed beyond recognition. What was once a small, struggling settlement had become a bustling town, with new faces arriving from all directions, eager to carve out a life in the unforgiving wilderness. Thomas had watched the growth of the town with a mixture of pride and humility. He had never sought fame or glory, only survival. And yet his work had left an indelible mark on the town, on the lives of those who had come after him. One quiet winter evening, as Thomas sat by the fire, the snow falling gently outside, he couldn't help but think back to the first winter he had spent in his Quonset hut. It seemed like a lifetime ago. At that time, he had been fighting simply to stay alive, to prove that survival in the mountains didn't have to mean suffering. But now, looking out at the peaceful landscape, he saw a different picture. His hut had not just protected him from the cold, it had inspired a way of life. Thomas had long since stopped worrying about the future of Coldridge. It was no longer his responsibility to fight the elements. He had done what he set out to do. He had laid the groundwork for future generations to thrive, not just survive. The Quonset hut was no longer just his idea. It had become a part of the fabric of Coldridge itself. But as the harsh winds of winter blew through the valley once more, Thomas felt the weight of his years. His body had grown tired, and his steps had slowed. He knew that his time was drawing near, and that the town he had helped build would continue to thrive long after he was gone. He had given everything to Coldridge, and in return, he had witnessed a transformation that most men could only dream of. In his final days, Thomas found peace in the knowledge that he had done something truly remarkable. He had turned the wilderness into a place not of mere survival, but of hope, ingenuity, and perseverance. His legacy would live on in every Quonset hut built in Coldridge and beyond, in every person who had learned to adapt, to innovate, and to face the future with courage. The final winter of Thomas's life was a peaceful one, spent by the fire in his beloved Quonset hut, watching the snow fall gently outside. And as he closed his eyes for the last time, he knew that he had done more than just survive the frontier. He had conquered it, and in doing so had given others the tools to do the same. His work was done, but his legacy would endure forever. The winter of 1879 was unlike any other Thomas had ever witnessed in Coldridge. The snow came heavy, blanketing the valley in a thick, unyielding layer of white. The wind howled through the mountain passes, sending waves of snow over the ridge and into the town. It was a cruel reminder that, for all of their efforts and ingenuity, nature could still be an unforgiving force. But inside the Quonset hut, the warmth was as steady as ever. The crackling of the fire echoed in the otherwise still cabin, the only sound breaking the silence of the winter night. Thomas sat in his favorite chair, his hands resting on the arms, a well-worn book lying open on his lap. The firelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with the years. He was growing older, his body less sturdy than it once had been. His hair had turned gray, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp as the day he first envisioned the Quonset hut. He glanced around the familiar interior of his cabin, taking in the sight of the walls, the stove, the shelves lined with tools, and the small table where he had sat countless times to sketch out his ideas. All of it was a part of him now, a part of his legacy. He had lived here through years of hardship and joy, and now, in his final years, he found peace in knowing that Coldridge had become something far greater than he could have imagined. Outside, the wind howled with an eerie force, but inside, the temperature never dipped below the comfortable warmth he had worked so hard to achieve. It was a constant, like the seasons themselves. Yet, as Thomas sat in the quiet of his hut, he knew his time was coming to an end. The energy he once had to build, to experiment, to innovate, had begun to fade. His hands no longer moved as swiftly as they once did. His mind, although still sharp, felt the weight of years spent battling the elements. Though he had never feared death, Thomas felt the weight of his own mortality more keenly now. He had lived a life of purpose, but there was still a part of him that wondered what would become of his work once he was gone. Would the Quonset hut still stand? Would the ideas he had pioneered continue to thrive? Or would they fade, buried beneath the snow, forgotten by time? On one particularly cold night, as the storm outside raged louder than ever, Thomas felt a deep weariness settle over him. His body was tired, and his mind was tired too. He closed the book in his lap and placed it on the table beside him. The fire crackled in front of him, but his eyes grew heavy. For a moment, he thought of the people who had come after him, those who had built upon his work, creating homes, shelters, and futures from the foundation he had laid. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that his work had not only survived, but had shaped the lives of others. With a soft breath, he closed his eyes, his heart light, knowing that the legacy he had built in Coldridge would continue long after he was gone. The news of Thomas Granger's passing spread quickly through Coldridge, though it wasn't accompanied by the fanfare that would have followed a more famous man. In a town like theirs, built on survival and hard work, death was often a quiet affair, acknowledged but not celebrated. Yet for the people of Coldridge, and for many others who had learned from Thomas's vision, his passing marked the end of an era. At his memorial, those who had known him stood in reverence. Samuel Bridger, one of the first to embrace Thomas's Quonset hut, stood with a heavy heart, his hat in his hand. Elijah, now an older man with children of his own, had come to pay his respects, standing silently beside the fire that Thomas had once stoked with his own hands. He, too, had passed on Thomas's lessons to his own children, ensuring that the next generation understood the importance of innovation and survival in the wilderness. Though Thomas had lived simply, his legacy was anything but small. The Quonset hut he had designed had not only withstood the test of time, but had evolved. It was no longer just a shelter for the harsh winter months. It had become a cornerstone of frontier life. People from neighboring towns and faraway settlements had come to Coldridge to learn from Thomas's creation, to see how one man's invention could change the lives of so many. Elijah, now an experienced builder in his own right, had worked alongside Thomas in the later years of his life. He had helped expand on the original Quonset design, making it more efficient, more sustainable, but it was still Thomas's ideas, his ingenuity, that served as the foundation of everything they had built. Elijah now led the next generation of builders, ensuring that the Quonset hut continued to serve the needs of the frontier. As the years passed, Coldridge grew even more vibrant, attracting settlers who had heard of its thriving community and its unique homes. Thomas's influence stretched far beyond the confines of his valley, with his Quonset huts dotting the landscape of the American frontier. They became symbols of strength, resilience, and innovation, just as Thomas had intended. Though Thomas was gone, the principles he had instilled in those around him remained steadfast. His legacy lived on in every Quonset hut that stood firm against the elements, in every family that used it to weather the storm. The lessons he had taught, that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding ways to thrive in the face of it, were passed down from one generation to the next. As the seasons continued to change and the storms of winter gave way to the warmth of summer, Coldridge continued to thrive. The town was no longer defined by its struggle against the elements, but by its resilience and ingenuity. And in the hearts and minds of its people, the spirit of Thomas Granger, the man who had dared to build something new in a world that had always been cold and unforgiving, lived on forever. His work had changed the landscape of the frontier, not with tools and timber alone, but with a vision that had transformed lives. Years had passed since Thomas Granger's death, and Coldridge had grown from a small, isolated town into a bustling community, its heart pulsing with the spirit of innovation Thomas had ignited. The Quonset hut, once a radical idea in the face of skepticism, was now a staple of survival in the frontier. The design had not only endured but evolved, shaped by the hands of those who had learned from Thomas's work and added their own contributions. Elijah, now an elder in the community, stood at the edge of a new settlement, looking out over the rolling landscape. He had helped many families build their own Quonset huts, passing down Thomas's knowledge, but he had also developed new techniques, improving the structure's resilience against even the most unforgiving conditions. The Quonset hut, while still holding the core principles of Thomas's design, had become a much more refined structure, incorporating modern advancements in insulation, water collection, and even solar power. As Elijah gazed out at the rows of Quonset huts that dotted the landscape, a deep sense of pride filled his heart. These homes had become more than just shelters. They had become symbols of a new way of life, a way that didn't just focus on surviving the elements, but on thriving in them. The ingenuity that had been sparked by Thomas's invention had taken root, and now it was growing into something far greater than Thomas could have ever envisioned. He thought about the legacy Thomas had left behind, how one man's idea had transformed the way the settlers of Coldridge lived. What began as a simple solution to surviving a harsh winter had blossomed into a way of life, a philosophy that embraced innovation and adaptability. Coldridge was no longer a town defined by its struggle against the elements, but by its resilience and the resourcefulness of its people. As Elijah walked through the settlement, greeting familiar faces, he couldn't help but notice how much had changed. The town was now a hub for pioneers from other regions, drawn to Coldridge by the promise of new ideas and the chance to be part of something greater. They came not just to survive, but to thrive, to learn from those who had built something lasting and meaningful. The town's success was a testament to the power of innovation and the strength of community. Despite the advancements and the many improvements that had been made, the town had never forgotten Thomas's contributions. His name was still spoken with reverence, his story told to every newcomer, and his original Quonset hut design stood as a monument at the center of Coldridge. It was there in the heart of the town that Thomas's spirit lived on. For all his humility, Thomas Granger's legacy had become a living, breathing thing. The Quonset huts were more than just structures. They were the embodiment of a mindset, a belief that survival didn't have to be a struggle, that with ingenuity, resourcefulness, and hard work, people could thrive even in the most difficult circumstances. And as long as there were settlers in the frontier, that legacy would never be forgotten. As the years continued to roll by, the story of Thomas Granger and his revolutionary Quonset hut had become part of the folklore of Coldridge. His name was passed down through generations, not just as a man who had survived the wilderness, but as a pioneer of innovation, someone who had changed the very fabric of life in the mountains. His story was told around campfires, in classrooms, and at the dinner tables of every Quonset hut in town. The town had prospered, but there were signs of change once again. A new generation of settlers had come to Coldridge, many of them from more populated areas, with different ideas about life and progress. Some were eager to carry forward the traditions that Thomas had started, while others sought to modernize and innovate in ways that Thomas might not have imagined. The spirit of innovation was still alive in Coldridge, but now it was beginning to take on new forms. Elijah, now in his later years, found himself reflecting on all that had changed. The original Quonset huts still stood strong, but they were now part of a larger, more connected world. The town had grown, and with it, the dreams and ambitions of its people. The Quonset huts had laid the foundation, but it was the people who had breathed new life into them, adapting them for their own needs and aspirations. But no matter how much the town had changed, there was one thing that would never be forgotten: the impact of one man's idea. Thomas Granger's work had not only provided shelter, it had fostered a culture of self-reliance and innovation that would continue for generations to come. As the town of Coldridge expanded, and as new technologies and ideas began to shape the future, the essence of what Thomas had built remained intact, a reminder that, in the face of adversity, it was creativity and perseverance that would ensure survival. One particularly cold evening, Elijah sat outside his own Quonset hut, the fire crackling softly beside him. The stars sparkled overhead, and the wind whispered through the trees. He thought of Thomas, of the countless hours spent working together on the hut, of the long nights spent in the warmth of that simple, sturdy structure. Thomas had taught him that survival wasn't just about enduring the harsh conditions of the frontier, but about embracing the challenge, about finding solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. Elijah smiled softly to himself. He knew that Coldridge would continue to grow, continue to evolve. New challenges would arise, and new generations would face them. But the lessons that Thomas had taught would never be forgotten. They would live on in the hearts of every settler who looked to the future with hope, ingenuity, and the courage to adapt. As the fire flickered in the darkness, Elijah stood, ready to continue his work. The legacy of Thomas Granger had not only withstood the passage of time, it had inspired a new generation to take the lessons of the past and build a future that was brighter, warmer, and more resilient than ever before. And as long as there were those willing to learn from it, Thomas's spirit would continue to guide them forward, one Quonset hut at a time. The town of Coldridge had long since left behind its humble beginnings. The Quonset huts had become more than just functional homes. They were the foundation of a thriving community that had learned to adapt to every challenge. People from far and wide came to Coldridge, drawn by the stories of Thomas Granger and his incredible innovation. They arrived with their own hopes and dreams, ready to contribute to the ever-growing legacy he had left behind. One chilly morning, a new group of settlers arrived at Coldridge. They were young, eager, and full of energy. Among them was Emma, a bright-eyed woman with a deep love for sustainable living. She had heard about Coldridge's success and the Quonset hut revolution, and she had come to see it for herself. Emma had spent years studying modern innovations in sustainable energy and building methods, but the Quonset hut intrigued her. It was a practical, simple design that had withstood the test of time. She wondered if she could adapt it even further, incorporating new ideas to make it even more energy efficient. As Emma walked through the town, she marveled at how much it had grown. The once small settlement now boasted a growing community center, gardens, and even small businesses. There was a sense of unity in Coldridge, a spirit that had been born from survival, but now thrived on collaboration and forward thinking. The community had evolved, but it had never forgotten the principles of Thomas Granger's design, resilience, adaptability, and innovation. Emma made her way to the heart of the settlement, where the oldest Quonset huts still stood, solid and unchanged. They were symbols of the past, but they also served as reminders of how far the town had come. She stood there deep in thought, imagining the future. The legacy of Thomas Granger, though rooted in the past, would continue to inspire Coldridge for years to come. In the distance, a figure approached, and Emma's thoughts were interrupted. It was Elijah, the man who had carried on Thomas's vision for so long. Now an elderly figure, Elijah had spent the years after Thomas's death guiding the town, ensuring that the lessons of the past would shape the future. "Emma, I see you've come to carry the torch forward," Elijah said, his voice warm with the wisdom of a lifetime. Emma smiled, feeling a sense of purpose. "I think it's time to take the next step," she replied. "Thomas's idea was incredible, but now it's up to us to keep building on it." And so, as the sun rose over the valley, Emma knew that Coldridge's story was far from finished. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where innovation would continue to thrive. Years passed, and Coldridge grew into a beacon of hope and progress. What had started as a small community built around the Quonset hut and the vision of Thomas Granger had evolved into a town that embraced new ideas while honoring its roots. The original Quonset huts remained, standing strong against the elements, but now they were part of a larger, more diverse community. The town had become a symbol of how innovation, when combined with the wisdom of the past, could create a sustainable future. Emma, now a respected leader in Coldridge, had successfully integrated new technologies into the Quonset hut designs. Solar panels, rainwater collection systems, and even small-scale wind turbines had been added to the original structure. The huts were more energy efficient than ever, and the town was completely off the grid, relying on its own resources. It was a self-sustaining community, powered by the ingenuity of its people and the foundation Thomas had laid down all those years ago. Elijah, in his later years, often sat on his porch looking out over the town he had helped guide. He saw the fruits of his labor in the thriving community that had sprouted from Thomas's vision. He had lived long enough to see the Quonset hut become not just a shelter, but a symbol of what could be accomplished when people worked together for the greater good. The Quonset hut had evolved, but it still held true to its roots. It was a home built to withstand the worst that nature could throw at it, and it had served the people of Coldridge well. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Elijah reflected on the legacy that had been created. Coldridge was a place where innovation, community, and resilience flourished. And in the distance, the first settlers who had come to the town all those years ago could still be seen, working together, continuing the cycle of progress. Though Thomas Granger had long since passed, his spirit lived on in every corner of Coldridge. The Quonset hut, once just a simple idea to survive the harsh winters of the frontier, had become a symbol of what could be achieved when people dared to think differently. And as the town continued to grow, its story was never forgotten. It was a legacy built on ingenuity, perseverance, and the belief that, no matter the challenge, people could create a better life for themselves and their future generations. The Quonset hut was more than just a building. It was a lasting impact, a living testament to the power of innovation and the human spirit.